It's as if we've invented this bad guy in order to say, sorry, we can't look after the poor, we can't pay welfare benefits because the bond markets might not like it. And again, I think that's a delusional thing which politicians use as a way of getting out of their proper obligations and responsibility.
Anne, thank you so much for joining me on The Breakdown.
Pleasure. Lovely to be here.
Could you just start off by introducing yourself and your work? You have quite an impressive resume, so maybe the abridged version.
So my name is Ann Pettifor, and I'm director of something called Policy Research in Macroeconomics. And I've written a few books, and I'm an activist in the financial system, basically. But I call myself an international political economist. I work in the field of IP, international political economy.
Great. Okay, well, we'll delve into exactly what that means. But I think that the best place to start, and this may seem overly simplistic, but I think it's necessary, is just with a common misconception that you unpack in your book, which is how we understand money. So very simply, what is money?
Gosh, it's such a big question. So money is nothing more than a social construct. It's actually one of civilization's greatest achievements, in my view. As we've evolved over centuries, we've worked out a system of transacting in ways which enable us to make progress, sometimes too much progress. But it's a social construct. It is everywhere and everything. It is a promise to pay in the future. That's all it is. It's a promise to pay. We call it credit. Credit is money, and money is credit. And once you understand that, it becomes less complicated, because that's how we experience money on an everyday basis. Many of us have, not all of us, but many of us have a credit card. And when you think about a credit card, there is no money in your credit card account. In fact, the bank prohibits you from putting deposits into your credit card account. So when you wave the credit card at a machine in a coffee shop, or at a shopkeeper, or at Amazon, all that's happening is that the credit card says you can trust Ann Pettifor to pay £6.30 for a coffee and croissant in London, or £300 for a washing machine. And that's all it does. It says that. And the card indicates your trustworthiness. If you're not very trustworthy or not very creditworthy, you have a simple card. If you're a princess from Saudi Arabia, you'll probably have some fancy big gold-studded card. But anyway, any shopkeeper seeing that princess's card will know she's good for a lot of money. So that's what credit is, this promise to pay. But the problem is, for it to be money and for it to circulate and for it to have value requires that it's regulated, that it is, because we all cheat. I speak as someone who cheats all the time. When I'm on my bicycle, I'm forever dodging red lights. It's something that's endemic to human nature. So we need regulations and laws to uphold the contracts we make when we promise to pay. And so we've built up institutions that make that promise to pay something meaningful. And those institutions include the criminal justice system for enforcing contracts and sending you to jail when you break your contract. It requires a good monetary system, by which I mean it needs a central bank that can be trusted. And it needs a commercial banking system which can act as a go-between. And it requires, beyond that, it requires a state which is setting up a currency, and the value of that currency, that is the money in which you are making your promises, relates to the strength of the economy from which you originate. So I've just been in Ghana in Africa, and my pound sterling was worth an awful lot more than the Ghanaian cedi, and that's because Ghana's economy is much smaller and more fragile than the British economy. And my currency, so your currency reflects that. But for a currency to have strength, the state needs to set up taxation systems, institutions and taxation systems, so that the state can collect tax revenues. And it's those tax revenues which provide the collateral that make your pound sterling valuable. In Ghana, they don't have a sound tax collection system. They're trying to improve on their tax. In places like Malawi, there is no tax collection system at all. And on the whole, the IMF and the World Bank discourages these countries from building the public institutions that would give them sound money. And so they rely on other people's money, on the dollar or on Japanese yen and so on. We're very fortunate. Our currency is a strong one. We live in a strong, rich economy. And so that's the money system. And it's made overcomplicated, it's made to appear complex, and I think that's a conspiracy to keep us all ignorant of what's really going on behind the scenes. And so that's the mission of my book, is to make it accessible to ordinary people to understand the system, really.
And there's a lot I want to come back to there, particularly about the kind of differences in how countries are treated in the kind of global financial system. And I think that's really important when it comes to how we respond to climate change, for example.
Indeed.
But before we get there, a bit more sort of laying of the foundations. And one thing that I found really compelling in your book, and I think is really clearly laid out, is how we misunderstand money to our detriment, or maybe that people deliberately misrepresent it as a commodity, as something that is inherently scarce, like a commodity like oil or lumber or anything else we're familiar with. And I just wondered if you could explain kind of the origins of how we came to understand it in that way and the implications that has for scarcity in the economy.
Sure. So what we did originally, way back in the day, the Florentine bankers, people would hold their wealth in gold or big round wheels or cigarettes or wheat or bales of wheat or whatever, a sense of, look, this shows you how wealthy I am. In Florence, the Florentine bankers took to building the vaults needed to protect the gold of traders. Traders who'd want to move to England, say, to buy wool from the English, would not want to take their gold en route because they're bound to be robbed. So they would leave it behind in the vault, and the goldsmith, as he would call it, or the Florentine banker, would give a receipt, say, there's this much gold in this account. And that receipt became his money. He would then go to the wool merchant and say, look at this receipt. And the wool merchant would be duly impressed and hand over bales of wool. And so that thing, which represented his wealth or her wealth, then becomes the sort of fetishized. This becomes the thing. It is the representation of my promises. I can make many promises because I've got all this gold. It's a representation of that. It's not the thing. And that confusion between the social aspect, the promise to pay, and the representative thing, which is the commodity, the piece of paper or a checkbook or a credit card. You know, a credit card isn't money, but it represents something. And then in the minds of theoreticians, commodity becomes money. Now, I think, again, as you can tell, I am a conspiracy theorist. I think that people like the idea of calling it a commodity for several reasons, because then you can create scarcity. You can say there's only this much money. And the Bitcoiners are expert at that. They designed a Bitcoin to be very limited in number. I can't remember how many were to be mined in the first place, but Yashimoto, was that what he was called? Mm-hmm. He set it up to have a finite number of Bitcoins. And the point about it had to be finite, else it wouldn't have value. Just like gold is finite, there's not a lot of gold, so that's why gold has value. Something that's plentiful, like water, for example, doesn't have the same value. So Bitcoin is invented to be finite and therefore to become a scarce asset, and therefore to become an asset which can be inflated by too many people wanting to buy it. And they love that aspect of it. So the key thing about Bitcoin is that it pumps and dumps, goes up and down, and it's the volatility that makes the money, that makes the profits for the people that own it. But it can't be a money because it is scarce. And the joyful thing, and sounds contradictory because our monetary system is so rotten in so many respects, but the joyful thing about the promise to pay is that it's not finite. What is finite is what I can promise. I would like to promise the earth, but I can't because the earth is finite. I would like to promise that I can afford to buy, a diamond ring when I really can't. So we're limited by our capacities, but also by the environmental restraints on us. There's a limit to how much you can promise of what is available to use, to exploit. So this idea of scarcity is built into the idea of commodity money. And then they can say, sorry, we've run out of money. We can't afford to feed the poor. We can't afford to cut welfare benefits. We can't afford to give little children a decent income. When in reality, our wealth, in the British economy, is such that we can make promises to help the poor. We can easily afford it. There's no question about it. But thinking about money as a commodity disables us from affording it. And that's convenient for those who are in control of the money system. But there's another reason, and actually that only dawned on me in this book, when writing this book, which is that if you talk about money as a commodity, you can trade money across borders. Now, in reality, you can't trade money across borders. Why? Because you're trading my promise to pay with someone who lives in China or someone who lives in the United States. They have to trust my promise to pay, but my promise to pay is enforced here under these laws, not under your laws, and there isn't an international law, in a sense, that obliges me to pay. So promises. So actually, that's the justification for capital flowing across borders. That's the justification for us to trade money. And I'm arguing, actually, it's not that you can't do that. You can trade commodities, but money is not a commodity, and so you shouldn't be trading it. It needs to be in the domain in which it's regulated. So within the Ghanaian domain, the cedi is regulated. To take the cedi into a global system and try and deal with it would be crazy. Within our domain, sterling is regulated. And it's this wanting to break down those regulatory guardrails that is what makes globalization and that what makes financialization, which is so dangerous, in my view.
And so when you are the British government, say, your promise that you can pay, that's based on trust that, for example, you will continue to have tax revenues for generations into the future. Is that?
Absolutely. So you've got 30 million taxpayers. This is not like Apple. Apple relies on me to pay my phone bills or to repay my installments if I bought it on credit. But that in a sense relies on my voluntary willingness to do so, and they can go after me if I fail. But for the government, by law, we are forced to pay taxes. There's many of us who try to evade that, of course. But there's a legal insistence on taxpayers, and we know that legal framework will be in place for another 30 years, but also for another 100 years at least. Back in the 1800s, when Jane Austen was writing her books, women who had access to long bonds that were providing interest over time, were considered very wealthy. And those bonds were sometimes 100 years long in their terms. And that's because the British government was trusted to repay over 100 years. And that's the good thing. It means you can spread the payment or the borrowing over that period of time and repay in good time. And it means that people who borrow over that time have a source of income for 100 years. So, government bonds and US Treasury bills are the safest assets and collateral in the world.
So then the practical implications of that for the government, we'll stick to the UK, but this could apply in many places. Although not equally around the world, which we will get to. But, you hear so much in politics, ad nauseum that the restrictions that we face when it comes to, for example, investing in what we need to address the climate crisis, or as you point out, to, provide meals to, school children, the kind of basics of a decent society, that we face constraints because there is a scarcity of money, that, there are limits to what we can do.
Yeah.
What does that get wrong or right?
So the point is there are limits, let's face it. I'm not pretending that there aren't. But the question is we can limit ourselves, or else we can create the conditions in which we can generate the income needed to repay any bond that we may issue. So if you put it in practical terms, we need to tackle the climate crisis. That work is labor-intensive work. It requires an awful lot of labor. We need to retrofit our housing. We need, in my part of the world, up in Suffolk, we need to build flood defences. We need to deal with droughts. We need to support farmers, and we need to transform the agricultural sector. That needs investment and spending. There's all of this that we need to do. And the way we need to do it in such a way as to generate the income needed to repay the debt when we issue a bond. So I'm the British government. I'm very powerful. I've got 30 million taxpayers paying me every year. I issue a bond, promise to pay. What I ought to do every time I do is to ensure that I'm in creating employment, because more than anything else, employment generates income for the persons who are employed. It generates income for wherever they spend their money. And above all, it generates tax revenues to help the government repay the bond. And it's because governments don't do that kind of labor-intensive investment that they get into difficulties. So right now, we have unemployment rising. We're shrinking the economy. And as we shrink the economy, so the public overdraft, the deficit rises, and public debt rises, and the economy and income in the economy falls. Right now, our Chancellor has cut our income even further. She's cutting back income and putting it into the government's coffers. And that imbalance results in a big public debt. If you want to reduce the public debt, then invest money in employment, and the balance changes, because the income generated by tax revenues restores balance to the budget. Now, I'm not in favour of, endless deficits and of unbalanced budgets. I think we can afford to have a deficit, and we can afford to have an unbalanced budget for a while. Just as when I take out a mortgage, it's massively unbalanced when I first take out 300,000 or £1 million to buy a flat in London. But over time, it recedes that. So, if we only invested in creating income-generating employment, we could balance budgets and keep the system relatively stable and afford to finance everything we need to do.
And what about the people who say that, we don't really owe that debt to anyone other than, for example, the Bank of England? What's the role of central banks in this?
Right. Well, I'm on a tear when it comes to central banks. It's just incredible. So central banks have enormous power. Yeah. They have the state's foundational power. And the state's foundational power is that, unlike HSBC, the central bank is backed by this powerful state with all its tax revenues. And it's not just income tax, it's VAT. I had to pay VAT on something. Oh, yes, I know. We had building works done to our roof because, of course, it's flooding and we needed new guttering. The VAT on that bill was, nearly £1,000, and the bill was about £3,000. So the government's creaming in money from all of those activities. So the central bank should be issuing the bonds and helping the state finance economic recovery. Instead, our central banks are oriented towards looking after global financial markets. And that reorientation of the central bank away from the state, you need to know that the Bank of England was nationalised in 1945 by the Labour government because its governor had behaved so devastatingly badly in the 1930s in aligning the bank with capital markets. For example, the Germans wanted to confiscate Czechoslovakia's gold. And the Bank of England said the German government had every right to do that. against the will of a government fighting fascists. So for those reasons, the Bank of England was nationalised in 1945, and it was there to support, for example, the Labour government. And we're busy working on the horror of fiscal rules at the moment, this group that I'm part of. And we're saying that if in 1945 there'd been fiscal rules, it would not have been possible for the Labour government to have built the NHS, to have built a huge education system across the board, free education, to have nationalised the coal mines, to have built public housing, etc., etc. But that's what they were able to do when the debt was really very high. And that they were able to do because the Bank of England helped, supported, worked with the government rather than against the government. And right now, the Bank of England works in opposition to the government. So monetary policy is fighting against fiscal policy. And it's doing it in a very overt way. And the governor of the bank is very clear about doing that. I have no time for Liz Truss, but she wasn't brought down by the markets. She was brought down by the Bank of England. But that's a longer story. So the point is that the Bank of England, which now houses the foundational power of the state, has become independent of the state and is oriented towards global capital markets, in contrast to what was the case between 45 and 71. And that's been hugely damaging for us. I'm not saying we should do a Donald Trump and take over the Bank of England and make sure it's only political appointees that go on the board. But I am saying that fiscal policy and monetary policy should be working in tandem and not in opposition to each other. And currently, central bank technocrats are behaving like sort of, lords of the manor, basically. They're unaccountable, but they're on the state's payroll. I mean, they're being paid by my taxes and your taxes. They are civil servants, but they're not behaving as civil servants. Quite the contrary. So that has to change, in my view.
I'm sure Liz Truss will be glad to know you agree. She was brought down by the deep state. But I actually want to pick up on the bond markets before we get into the kind of concrete, real-world kind of experiences of all this, which is that I think there is something true to maybe not if the Bank of England may have been more important in Liz Truss's case, but in general, the kind of power that the bond markets hold in kind of disciplining governments who do something that they disagree with. Could you just unpack a little bit how that works, this idea of the bond vigilante?
Well, I think this is an enemy invented by Bill Clinton and his advisors for purposes that served them then. The bond markets are massively dependent on the collateral that the British government provides, which is the government's bond is the safest asset in the whole world. The speculators in the bond markets are looking for assets into which to invest their capital gains, to keep them safe. They both want to put their capital gains in a safe asset, and they also want to earn interest on those capital gains. If they put their capital gains into gold doesn't generate interest. It's of no use at all. It sits there. The price of gold may go up and you may benefit from that, but it may also go down, right? But in the case of a government bond, you both get the very safe asset and you get flows of income into the future, absolutely guaranteed, right? So this is a fantastic asset. Bond markets crave this asset. When Bill Clinton decided to balance the budget in 2000 and to develop a surplus, there was a massive shortage of US Treasury bills, and the bond markets nearly broke down. What they can do is they can buy a Rembrandt, for example, a work of art, and they can stash it away in a Dubai, a cold vault in a bank somewhere in Dubai. And they can use that asset as collateral to say, look, I hold a Rembrandt, which if I sold, I could easily repay my debts. But the problem with that is it's not income generating and it's not safe because that vault may break down. There might be, an uprising in Dubai and the whole thing might get destroyed. If you buy a property in London, equally, it's a wonderful, it's an asset whose value is rising. But who knows we could have an earthquake, we could have climate breakdown, we could have a revolution and you'd lose all that. But you wouldn't lose your treasury bond or your government bond, because that doesn't get destroyed in that way. So when we understand that, we understand the power that we have over the bond markets. I'm working currently with a wonderful bond market trader, Vincent Gomez, who was very active during the financial crisis. And he said, the bond market is terrified of the central bank, terrified because banks can alter the rates of interest. They have the power to create liquidity, i.e. money. And these are enormous powers that no institution has. And he said, we're terrified that they're going to do something that's going to harm our interest. So it's the reverse, really. But it's as if we've invented this bad guy in order to say, sorry, we can't look after the poor. We can't pay welfare benefits because the bond markets might not like it. And again, I think that's a kind of disingenuous, delusional thing, which politicians use as a way of getting out of their proper obligations and responsibility.
I think that's a real theme in all of your work, this book and all the others, which is this degree to which we've kind of ceded public control of what we do to the private authority of the market. So could you say a little bit more about that and maybe just the kind of history of that? So thinking, you talk a lot about Keynes. I would say you probably self-describe as a Keynesian.
I do.
And so maybe if you could just walk us through, I guess, the history of this transition to a system of finance that is so dominated by private actors who get to decide, what lending costs and therefore what we can do and who gets access to it.
So this gives me an excuse to tell a story that I really love about Keynes, And because the thing I like about Keynes is that he's a monetary theorist. He's not interested in fiscal policy. It's not the general theory of taxation and spending. It's the general theory of employment, which he considers the most important thing, interest and money. That was his absolute obsession. He said if you fix the financial system, you won't need to use fiscal policy to fix the economic system. So anyway, but back in 1919, he's a young economist and he's an advisor to the Treasury and he's in Versailles. And the European economy has been destroyed. France, the United States and Britain have turned up at Versailles, and now the discussion is what to do about Germany and Europe. And Keynes comes up with a very, very simple plan. He says, look, there's, all you have to do is make a promise to pay. So you get Germany to promise to pay, and Germany says, please, I promise to repay $1 million or whatever it was. There weren't euros at the time, which is at that time was a lot of money. All that has to happen is France, the United States, and Britain have to guarantee that bond, have to guarantee that if Germany were to default on that promise, then the three states would compensate bondholders, the markets. And so this is Keynes saying you can invent a financial system that will create money for the Germans at a time when there is no money. You don't have to ask Britain to go into her savings vaults and haul out the cash and give it to the Germans. All that Britain has to do is to promise to guarantee. In other words, he uses public authority to guarantee a loan. And he puts his proposal to the leaders. There is one aspect of the proposal which is difficult for the private sector, which is that Germany has to repay these three guarantors first before she repays anybody else. Anyway, he puts this proposal to them. It goes to the British government, they love it. The Treasury, for once. It goes to the French government, they love it. It goes to the American government, President Wilson. And he's being advised by a chap called Thomas Lamont, who at the time is the ambassador of Wall Street, he's called. Thomas Lamont gets Keynes's letter, unbeknownst to Keynes. He reads this letter, and what he can see is that countries will have to repay Britain and Germany and Britain, France and the US before they repay Wall Street. And Wall Street's loans are going to be subordinated to public authority. So he tells President Wilson, we can't possibly support this. And Keynes is horrified because they have no other idea of what to do. Instead, they leave Germany. And he says, he goes home and he writes the economic consequences of the peace. And he says, as a result of this, you've not provided any finance and any hope for Germany, you're going to have another catastrophic world war. He says this in 1919. And so it happened. So the reason I want to tell the story is that he is saying that you need public authority over markets in order to ensure regeneration and recovery. And you cannot leave it just to private market. I mean, the Wall Street was willing to finance the recovery in Europe, but at very high real rates of interest, which would have screwed Europe. And so Europe never did recover fully, and we did have another catastrophic world war. So this is the point about public. And what happened was, as a result, so then through the 1920s and 30s, Keynes is defeated, essentially. Nobody listens to him. And you get the 1929 crash, and you get the huge Great Depression. And Roosevelt is elected in 1933, and he recognizes what Keynes is saying, and he adopts quite a few of Keynesian policies. But he also dithers about and imposes austerity unnecessary at some point. And the world anyway goes to catastrophic world war. Come 1945, Keynes is part of the Bretton Woods Conference, and they decide to rebuild the economy, but this time not on the basis of private financial markets and deregulated, but on regulated financial markets across the world and the balanced trading system. So between 1945 and 1971, we have what all economists on left and right call the golden age of economics. And I grew up in that age, in the 1950s. It was, there was general prosperity, even in Africa where I grew up. So then by the 1960s, Wall Street had got pretty fed up with the state of affairs, and they began chipping away at it. And the establishment, actually, it wasn't Wall Street, it was the City of London, set up something called the Eurobond, which was a bond which kind of didn't belong to any national economy. And by that means, they were raising money, helping Wall Street get bonds in order to buy Russian gold, because at that time Russia was, not acceptable to most markets, and it wasn't easy to get your hands on Russian gold, and Wall Street wanted Russian gold. And the Eurobond system was a way in which Wall Street got its way. And that began breaking down the system of guardrails that had been set up by Keynes and the others in 1945. And then between 71 and now, we have what he experienced between 1919 and 1939, 20 years of totally deregulated private markets, financial mayhem, crises, and catastrophic war. And we seem to be hell-bent on that, and at a time of climate breakdown.
And the main guardrails there were controls over cross-border flows of finance?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
The main one was capital, management of flows across capital. Keynes was of the view, and this becomes so important when we're thinking about the climate, that economies should be able to govern themselves, essentially, and within a framework of law which could be applied and enforced, essentially. If you're a thief and I have borders and I have a regulated border, but you choose to cross that border and escape, I can't go after you because the law applies only here, And so he felt it was really important for economies to be, in a sense, not entirely self-sufficient, because he was a great internationalist. He thought international coordination really important. But above all, that the economy, the central bank, the state should be oriented towards the domestic economy and make sure that was thriving. And when domestic economies were thriving everywhere, then international cooperation and coordination became easier as well. So that was what that was about.
And
for that, you needed to manage capital flows across borders. Sorry.
So what does that look like in, I guess, this slightly strange context we're now in, where maybe the sort of peak globalization era is coming to its end?
Yeah.
And you have figures like the President of the United States imposing really steep tariffs, for example, and kind of returning to a more inward, kind of nationally facing approach to economics.
Yeah.
Is he going to resolve this issue, or?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because, in my view, and this is where Karl Polanyi is of so relevance to us, Trump is responding to the public who are demanding protection from markets in capital, in goods, but also in labor. And so people are feeling incredibly insecure, and rightly so, because they can't afford to send their kids to university, they can't afford healthcare, they can't afford to buy a house, a roof over their heads, and so on. And in those circumstances, they're looking to strong men and women for protection. And Donald Trump said, I'm going to look after you. I'm going to chase those Mexicans and Chinese out of the way, and I'll care for you. Well, in reality, he's not, because he's not looking after what Wall Street is doing, what private capital markets are doing to people. He's actually looting those markets. And while he is putting up protectionist defenses in the form of tariffs. But this reaction to government by markets is what was experienced in the 1930s. It becomes, government by markets becomes intolerable for society and for the ecosystem. And invariably people become nationalistic and protectionist. That's a reaction to that kind of governance by an institution which is, you can't elect, you can't vote for them, you can't vote them out, because they're out there deciding your interest rates and deciding your exchange rate and deciding whether there should be investment in your economy or not. And it's all beyond you, really. I mean, if you think of private equity taking over all our care homes, where are they? Who's private equity? What do I deal with them? And yet, they own care homes, they own water companies, they own blah. And people naturally are reacting to that. So there's great parallels with what happened in the 1930s. Unfortunately, there are also some pretty awful parallels, really.
Who are they? One of them is now the Prime Minister of Canada. Yeah, a private equity baron, Mark Carney.
Yeah.
Shout out to Brookfield Asset Management. I want to pull this into now a little bit of the kind of nuts and bolts of our daily life, and again thinking about how this plays into our response to climate and ecological breakdown.
Yeah.
And I think whether it's in food or other kinds of commodity like the oil markets or energy, we often have this image of, these are markets and people are trading, barrels of oil for X amount or bales of hay for X amount.
Yeah.
But there's a whole layer of financial infrastructure happening above that and kind of in the shadows of people sort of speculating on those physical trades themselves in this kind of like ephemeral space of derivatives and all these kinds of contracts.
Yeah.
So could you, well, it's very complicated, walk us through what those kind of look like. So maybe use the Chicago Mercantile Exchange as an example of the ways in which this extra layer of finance contributes to the price of things. It's not just, how much wheat we're producing and how much people want, this kind of simple supply and demand, but a whole extra layer that is impacting the prices that we would experience every day.
Yeah. So we live in a system where capital can move across borders without any friction. If I go to Ghana, I have the friction of a visa and the passport and blah, and I tell you it's pretty stiff friction. But capital can go effortlessly in and out, so there's that. But equally, we have global markets, and then we have a banking system out there, which is called the shadow banking system, which is where easy credit, easy money is generated. Now, any bank can issue credit if it's licensed by the central bank to do so. It can give me a mortgage of £1 million for a flat in London.
And it's creating money in the process.
And there isn't any money in the bank when they do that. It's they're giving you this promise to pay this credit, and you're able to then use that receipt to go and buy this property. But in the shadow banking system, these receipts are being created against collateral that we know nothing of. And so huge quantities of money, trillions, something like $214 trillion of financial assets are out there in the unregulated sphere. And the question is, this money is usually borrowed money. This is credit. But when I borrow money, I have to repay it at some point at a rate of interest. And if the interest is high, that requires a lot of repayment, right? And so what they're trying to do is to find assets that into which to put it safely, which we've already discussed, but also how to make extra money. So you've got all this easy money that's been created. We watched it being created during the COVID crisis when the central banks did what was called quantitative easing at very low rates of interest. And the rich became explosively rich during COVID because they could borrow this very cheap money. Now it's floating out around there. And where do I put it? Let me go and put it in oil or energy prices that are being bought and sold in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And let me, instead of taking the risk of buying barrels of dirty oil and having to store them in a warehouse, why don't I just go and bet or speculate or gamble on whether or not the oil price will go up by 5 cents or down by 5 cents? Because if I do that at a big enough scale, I can make a small fortune. Then I'll be able to repay all this debt that I've borrowed. So this speculative money is used because actually the prices of all important commodities, grains, food, agricultural goods, if you like, oil, energy, are all determined in these global markets. The gas price, for example, is determined in, I think it's called the Henry Hub market in the United States and an NPV here in Europe. And it's not done at home. And it's not a price that's agreed between a trader wanting a barrel of oil because they own Shell and they've got to give it to petrol companies and the Saudi prince who's got oil. These people don't determine the price. In particular, not the Saudi prince or BP or any of those big corporations. They don't fix their prices. Those prices are fixed in the market at Chicago, and it involves both those buying and selling real oil, but mainly it involves those gambling on the buying and selling of those oil barrels. So as a result, our cost of living crisis is generated by those markets. So when the Bank of England says, we're going to put up interest rates to clobber everybody at home, and especially, says the Bank of England governor, those earning wages or demanding higher wages, they completely miss the boat because that's not where the prices are rising. The prices are rising in these markets, and the Bank of England says nothing to do with me, Gov. So we have a really big problem. So that's going on the one hand, and that's, it's very hard to know what exactly is going on. We're terrified of it because the last series of financial crises we've had have originated in this shadow banking system. And we know that they're capable of precipitating quite serious crises. But, we have chosen to design an international financial system which enables people to operate there. And until we get that sorted, we're going to have very unstable markets at home and very high cost of living crises here too.
Mm. And what would it look like to sort that out?
To sort that out, I think, would be quite simple, really. We would simply demand that flows of capital in and out of countries across borders must be taxed. It's as simple as that. Just as you have to tax goods coming and going if you have a tariff on your goods. It's called the Tobin tax. That's one way of thinking about it. Sand in the wheels of flows of capital. Here in Britain, I remember the Bank of England at the height of the housing price crisis, especially in London, suddenly introduced what's called a macroprudential device, which is to say to foreigners investing in London property that you had to put down a bigger deposit than locals would have to put down. In other words, you'd have to put down a higher level of payment on your deposit than the locals would have to do, as a way of offering more of a guarantee against the purchase or borrowing on that asset. Now, that was a form of capital control. Immediately, the London property market cooled down. People thought, no, I don't have to add. I want to be able to just put on a low deposit and just borrow a lot of money and buy a house. Now I've got to put down more. I don't think I'm inclined to do that. So that's just, and it's not complicated to apply. And it doesn't have to apply. It only applies to people with that much capital to be able to buy all those properties in London. So these are just tools that can be used by the central bank to moderate the flow of capital across borders. And I don't like to use the term control. I think we should talk about managing these flows. If you think of Eric Smith, who runs the Apple Corporation, it's a global outfit, the idea that he would leave his company to markets to decide, what goes in and what comes out of the company is crazy. And he would never dream of it. He manages his company. And I think our government should be managing our economy in that way too.
And I think, what's interesting about this and speaks to that point about capital moving between different countries and the impacts that has, is that one of the big restrictions in addressing the climate crisis in particular is this inequality in access to money and access to credit globally.
Yeah.
And the fact that if you are a lower income country, then you face far higher interest rates to borrow on the markets to finance what you need to do, whether that's, moving from coal power to clean energy, or whether that's, more often than not adapting, right? So being able to set up flood defenses or sort of adapt your economy to being on the front lines of these impacts. And what would it look like to resolve that issue? It seems to me one of those questions that when I put it to people, it's maybe the hardest one to answer, or it seems that way, which is, it's really unfortunate, but there's no way to get around the fact that, the private sector just doesn't want, it's higher risk, and so they'll charge more to lend to these countries. Is there a way to get around that kind of injustice and support the entire world to be able to act on the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think there is. By that, but first of all, we have to manage capital flows. And one of the reasons we have to manage capital flows is because we have to manage the most important lever in the economy, and something that I think is of profound importance, and that environmentalists as well as economists tend to neglect, and that's the rate of interest. Now, throughout history, 2,000 years, we've had history of faiths declaring usury to be sinful. Those Florentine bankers couldn't get their daughters married in a church or find themselves buried in sacred ground if they were found guilty of usury. And so they used to cover up their usurious interest rates in all kinds of ways in order to have, the backing of the church, of the Catholic Church. We've dropped that sin of usury. We don't talk about that, but it is still a sin. And the reason it's a sin is that it's so extractive. If I have a high real rate of interest on a loan, I can extract fantastic amount of assets from a poor country. And I'm thinking right now of Sri Lanka. I don't know if you've been following the drama of Sri Lanka. I'm absolutely horrified by Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka defaulted on her debt. She's had catastrophic climate crises. All kinds of things have gone wrong. So she's defaulted. And now the IMF has come in and persuaded some private lenders to lend her. And they're lending at very high rates of interest. But even worse, the Bank of Sri Lanka, the state's bank, has set interest rates at 8% in real terms. When the economy is in what we call deflation, it's actually going into reverse. Inflation's a good thing sometimes because prices are rising and people make money out of rising prices. But when prices go into negative, you're in dangerous 1930s Great Depression territory. And that's where Sri Lanka is at the moment. And her central bank is charging 8% on loans to the locals. Now, what that means is for the local farmer to repay his loan, he has to intensively work his land to double the productivity of his land. He has to get laborers to come onto the land and he has to make them work 17 hours a day because 8 hours a day isn't enough to get enough. So you're extracting from the ecosystem and you're extracting from labor to repay this man who's sitting on his bum lending you loads of money, really, because he's a private capital. He's acquired credit from central banks elsewhere under the COVID crisis with quantitative easing. And he's got all this easy money and he's throwing it at Sri Lanka and he's demanding the extraction. So this is why I want environmentalists to understand how powerful a tool the rate of interest is and how we have to limit it. And Keynes's great obsession was with very low rates, real rates of interest relative to inflation. And he's derided for that, actually. And of course he would be, because the markets love high rates of interest.
Sure.
So when the central bank fixes the base rate, that's the rate at which the state borrows from the bank. But it sets the rate for all the other rates in the market, for short-term loans, for long-term loans, for safe loans, for risky loans, for inflation-adjusted loans. And Keynes was very clear that that's the great sin of usury, really. And I want that sin of usury to come back again. I want to make these guys feel really, really guilty. I want them to go to hell for this, really. And we don't do that. We think, oh, no, it's just the rate of interest, So there's that. But to manage the interest rates for countries like Sri Lanka, she must be able to manage flows of capital across her borders. She must be able to manage those lenders who are lending to. Now, what I would much prefer to see is that rather than relying on international markets for her loans, Sri Lanka got that money from her own central bank. Her own central bank should say, yep, right now we're in a mess, but this country is rich, it's got hard-working people, they're educated, it's got rich resources, it's got great natural resources, they've stabilized their politics after a lot of division. I've got faith in this country. I'm going to give the government money to enable people to start working, to enable that farmer to grow his food, but not to have to do it in those highly extractive rates, and not to be dependent on Wall Street for financing. I mean, that's the world we have to get to. And to get to that, we have to start with capital controls.
And one of the other things that you talk about a lot, and I think this relates to this capital control question, although it is slightly different, is the fact that a lot of the time, countries are also required to hold US dollars.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of dollar hegemony, both in this kind of question of global injustice, but also, I guess, its role in limiting what we think we can do.
Sure. I mean, I hope
also get mad about the US dollar, so it's got it riled up.
No. I mean, this was another area in which Keynes was massively defeated at Bretton Woods. No. Right now, I'm involved in a big campaign to persuade the African Union to drop the dollar and to instead set up what's called a clearing union, whereby they would trade. African countries would trade with each other and would trade in their own currencies. And at the center of the system would be something like a central bank, which would say to Ghana, well, you've sold goods to South Africa. You're in deficit because you've bought more from South Africa than you've sold. You've got to get your act together and create more goods that South Africa wants, or buy less from South Africa. But you've got to balance that as well. And South Africa, by the way, you've got a massive surplus with Ghana. You're going to be penalized for that for that surplus. You better go buying Ghanaian goods and bringing down that imbalance. And so at the core of this clearing union would be the system of managing trade without anyone using any single currency. They would use their own currencies. So right now, and we could do that in Africa because Africa is fairly cohesive. Latin America isn't. The Latin Americans don't get on with each other, and they don't have something called the Latin American Union. There is something called the African Union, and they do fall out with each other, and it is complicated. But it's more of a cohesive continental institution than others. And that idea is modelled on the European payments union that came into effect in the 1950s here in Europe. When Europe was devastated post-war, and the Americans said, don't worry, it's okay, here's the Marshall Plan. You can have loads of dollars. And the Europeans said, thank you very much, and took all these dollars. But all they could do with the dollars was to buy American products. And that was the purpose of the Marshall Plan, is to help Americans keep up production post-war when their production of armaments had collapsed. And then the Europeans worked out, well, actually, that might be happening, but we're not developing our own economies. And so they set up a clearing union called the European Payments Union. And it was that which led to European recovery post-war. And I'm working with two wonderful Italian economists, Massimo Amato and Luca Fantacci, very good-looking Italian economists. And they do wonderful work on the European Payments Union. And I'm hoping to persuade the Africans to do the same. So what that means is that countries don't have to depend on a single hegemonic currency. Because at the moment they're thinking, oh, it could be the Chinese yuan. But really that's not in order. Because then it just becomes another hegemony in charge of your economy. And then there was talk about a digital currency and all that nonsense, but none of that really makes sense. So yes, the answer is clearing unions, for regional clearing unions for states across the world, and an ending of dependence on the US Treasury, on the dollar. Now, the last time we had a reserve currency that collapsed, we had a catastrophic war, and that was when sterling was no longer the world's reserve currency. And I mean, I don't think the Americans are going to make us feel hopeful about how the losing of their hegemonic power will make them feel. So, I'm not madly hopeful about all this, but we've got to have these ideas out there. We've got to have a plan B for when things do go belly up.
So I think a lot of the time, the target, rightly in many ways, of climate activists, of those of us who care about this problem, is the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
But you make the case that actually we might be looking at the wrong target and that we should be thinking more about finance. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I wanted to argue that the green movement, the environmental movement, is kind of placing the global economy into silos. And in one silo is the environment and is the biosphere. And in another silo is the financial system. And I want to say the two are tightly integrated, but that of the two, the financial system is by far the most powerful. And that if we want to tackle the fossil system, we've got to start by tackling the financial system. And, and the way to do that, for example, is to clip the wings of capital flight, if you like. Clip those wings, and that will have massive impact on investment in fossil fuel. And we have to prevent them having access to easy credit and access to valuable collateral. Now, we began to think about this in Europe. I don't know if you followed the work of Professor Daniela Gabor, but where the ECB began to think about saying to fossil fuel companies, we will not accept brown collateral. We will not accept if you put into the bank the fact that you own an oil field. Mm-hmm. That won't be enough to get you credit or for you to be able to buy European treasuries. You've got to provide me with green collateral. Immediately you would kill off the fossil industry, which is why the idea was killed off and why we don't have it yet. But we have an answer. We've already developed the idea of, because central banks can't just provide credit to a company. They have to get in return some collateral, and they have to hold that collateral. And they have got rules about what sort of collateral to hold. And we would just say, sorry, we don't want brown collateral, or dirty collateral, really, is what we should call it. And that immediately would kill off an awful lot. In fact, it would damage capitalism profoundly, really. And I want environmentalists to not do the siloing and to turn to the financial system and not to accept that it appears very complicated and beyond them. It's not. It really is not rocket science. If you can understand climate science, I can tell you, you can understand the financial system. And therefore, and also to understand the priority of going after it and managing it in order to be able to tackle the fossil sector.
And I think the financial system is so interesting to me insofar as it kind of simultaneously is betting on the future, and it has the ability to kind of create it and shape it because it gets to speculate on what it will look like, and it gets to create the credit that will bring that world about.
Yeah.
And you have an amazing anecdote in the book, which actually draws on an essay from The Breakdown. by Liliana Duganova, which I highly recommend, about the peculiarity with which finance and capital more broadly understands the future.
Yeah.
And obviously, when it comes to the climate crisis, that has real resonance. So could you just walk us through this strange relationship to the future?
Yeah, so capitalism, this was defined by an economist, a famous economist called Irving Fisher in the beginning of the 20th century. And he argued essentially that he described the way in which capital thinks about the future as thinking about an orchard. And he said, what you could think about is that there is an orchard, there's land, and there are trees. But the real wealth of that orchard isn't in the land and it isn't in the trees, it's in the apples. They generate future income. And therefore, what's really important are the apples. If there is no demand for apples, then the tree is worthless and the land is worthless. You can destroy the trees and turn over the land. And that understanding of land and of nature is terrifying, really, because it is what is behind extractivism, essentially. And this is most beautifully illustrated by the example of this company, Rockhopper, that decided it wanted to explore oil on the Adriatic coast. And the Italians rightly were up in arms about this, everyone locally and even nationally. And so they decided they were going to oppose this. And they went to the government and said, we don't want this to happen. Can you please block this oil exploration? And so the government did, at which point the company sued the Italian government and used this idea of the future, of capitalism's future, which is both that it generates income, but also that it can be discounted, because a dollar today is worth more than a dollar tomorrow. And these are contradictory ideas in one concept. Anyway, Rockhopper had invested $2 million in trying to extract oil off the Adriatic, and they were stopped. And they then sued the Italian government and said they had been due to make capital gains into the future of about $187 million. And so the Italian government compensated them for $187 million. So on an investment of $2 million, they made $187 million on the basis of this economic theory. And this is where I want people to understand that it's not just the fossil fuel exploiters that are the bad guys. Economists are also the bad guys. They really are the bad guys. So I think we need to understand that's the way they think about the future, which is why so many of the UN's IPCC reports have been overly optimistic, because they've been influenced by an economist called William Nordhaus, who says that the costs of preparing for the future are too high. And we mustn't therefore do that now, because it could be done better in the future and more cheaply. And so we mustn't make any provision for climate breakdown, which is terrifying. And he's been very, very influential. And not just him, but he's won the Nobel Prize for economics, by the way. But he's also influenced economists at the IPCC. Nicholas Stern, who wrote the Stern Review, refuted that view of the world. But it's what's so destructive about economic theorizing about the financial system and that impact on the climate system, which is terrifying.
And maybe this is a slightly pessimistic question to end on. Yeah. But I think, you've brought it up a couple times, and I'm interested to hear your kind of forward-looking perspective on where we stand in this moment. And you've mentioned a couple times the kind of analogies to the interwar period, the kind of rise of fascism in that era. And I think a lot is being made of that right now in this current context. Do you think that is a useful comparison, or do you think that this is something fundamentally different and we need to be thinking about this context, particularly with, advancing climate impacts and how that will be distributed globally? Do we need to be thinking about this moment in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not at all hopeful. I watched your interview with Andreas Malm, and I feel pretty depressed about the outlook, really. But my view is that a sustainable global economy is one in which countries are more self-sufficient than we are now. That we've got to learn, if you like, to grow our own green beans. I mean, in Britain, we import green beans from Kenya. We deplete their water table. and their labour force, just so that we can have fresh green beans on the table, when actually we are capable of growing our own green beans and of eating seasonally and so on. So this idea of a more convivial world, I end up the book saying we need to build convivial societies which are more self-sufficient and self-sustaining. We can create that world, but at the moment I think it's all pretty hopeless. The task for us now is to make hope. We have to have a plan B. We have to think about what could be done. And that's what this book is trying to do. Even in the face of such hopelessness, I think it is possible to begin to make hope. And that's what I sincerely hope my book will do.
Oh, well, you took my very hopeless question and turned it around. So well done, well done. I think we'll leave it there. Anne, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.